David, it's great to see you today.
Good to see you, Jason.
David, you're one of the foremost experts on the Putin regime, spending years of your life yourself as a journalist living in Moscow, and you've published a number of books about the Putin regime. So let me ask you, what do you think Vladimir Putin is looking for now? What does he actually want? Do you think he's at all plussed or bothered by the sheer quantity of civilians he's killing in Ukraine?
Well, to answer the second question first, no, he isn't bothered. And this is one of the things that should bother the West. Uh, he has developed during the 1990s, there were a lot of contract killings in Russia, particularly in St. Petersburg, by the way, where Putin was a government official. And there were many reports that the hired killers were bothered. Some of them went to witches and various parapsychologists and various occult healers to expiate their guilt. They said that they saw their victims in their dreams, and that the ghosts of the people they killed were not giving them any peace. Well, you can be sure that that reaction is not typical for Putin, for Patrushev, for the people around them. They have built up for themselves a rationalization that what they're doing is in the interest of the state, that they represent the interests of the state, and that basically the interests of the state are higher than the fate of any individual. And the more that this is reinforced, both inside the country and by the behavior of foreign leaders, the more they believe it, the more they're committed to it, and simultaneously, the more they're committed to further aggression, because they've redefined morality. What do they want out of all this? They want confirmation. They want confirmation of their insane ideas and their insane self-justification. And it's not something that can be stopped by negotiations, and it's not something that they can be persuaded to give up. Uh, it's not incidental or coincidental that the biggest killers, Putin, Patrushev, who played an integral role in the apartment bombings of 1999, which brought Putin to power, that these people, are the most visible churchgoers among world leaders. They are constantly being photographed at church services. Because the Orthodox rituals are a convenient reinforcement for this really insane self-justification, and to crack that, and it can be cracked. We have to show the same determination on the behalf of real values that they're able to show in defense of their criminal values. And we have to be able to persuade free people to the same degree, or maybe not to the same degree, but to a degree at least, in order to counteract their ability to process Russian masses. It's a terrible challenge, but in a sense, it's an emanation of what existed during the Soviet period, minus the Soviet ideology.
So where do you think that Putin gets it from? This depraved attitude where he treats humans as machinery to be used and thrown away, or if it's destroyed or killed, it doesn't really matter. What's the origins of that?
Well, this has its origins in the Soviet mentality. This affected Ukraine as well, at least to a certain extent. But what's happening in Ukraine is that people are trying to break away from it. That's the core motivation, really, that even goes beyond national identity. The idea they don't want to be part of this insane mentality, which of course has had terrible consequences for Ukraine and for the Ukrainians throughout their modern history. I think that what we're facing now is the consequences of what happened when the communists took power. because for communist ideology, it was a given that the individual has no soul, that he has no independent importance, that he derives importance from the social system, which is socialism, and the highest expression of his individuality is to serve the state. Uh, Now, this was backed up in the Soviet period by an elaborate ideology. That ideology has collapsed, but the same mechanism, even without the ideology, it's just instead of being motivated by a kind of abstruse theory, it's now motivated simply by criminal greed. But it's the same instinct, it's the same mechanism, the same idea that the individual counts for nothing and the state is everything and the individual is there to be used and his life has no independent value. That's why, unlike the contract killers in the 1990s, with whom you can to some extent compare the present leadership of Russia, what we have in Russia is really a version of Murder Incorporated. But what we're but by comparison with them, all remnants of conscience, individual conscience, have been destroyed, and they've been destroyed with the help of an ersatz morality that which is a logical successor to the morality of the Soviet Union, just minus the ideology.
Well, lacking ideology, what is it that Putin really wishes to achieve? Is he not using all of these elaborate arguments, putting himself at the center of what is the Russian state, just to cover up his own tracks? Because he is the one that benefits from the current structure that he's created in Russia. Or is it really an ideology? Does he really believe in greater Rus and all these things? And it's not simply
No, great. He would like us to believe that he believes in greater Rus. I mean, yeah, a couple of first of all, he when it was a question of preserving greater Rus, preserving the Soviet Union, he was on the side of the in 1991 during the August putsch. He was on the side of those who were working to dismantle the Soviet Union. There's an interesting story I heard, which is very, very indicative about his state of mind, which is that after the Soviet Union had fallen, the Communist Party in St. Petersburg moved into a building not far away from Smolny, which was the head, because they were forced to vacate Smolny, which was the historic center of the revolution and then became the headquarters of the Leningrad city government. And they put up a big Soviet flag from which they flew from the top of the building. This was even after the Soviet Union had fallen. And Anatoly Sobchak, who was the mayor of St. Petersburg, could see that the reformist, so-called reformist mayor of St. Petersburg, could see that flag from his office. He was becoming more and more irritated, and he sent people to take it down. And every time they took it down, the communists would put it back up. So in the middle of the night, two people arrived on the roof with an electric saw and cut down the flagpole. And then they fled. When the communists who were guarding the area, went up to try to stop them, and one of those people was the superintendent of a nearby building, a hotel which belonged to the KGB. Then it was renamed, I think, the Bureau of, the Ministry of Security, and Vladimir Putin. Putin was recognized, and this was reported on the television shows 600 Seconds. So here is Putin, who claims to be, killing people in the name of the Russian idea of greater Russia. But when it was in his interest, and who claims that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the century, was in fact all too happy to cut down the flag of the Soviet Union when it suited his boss and when it suited his ambitions at that time. Not a word that Putin says on any subject can be taken seriously. And this is something that our Americans need to understand and they need to assimilate. We have people who are totally unprepared to negotiate with Russians. Uh, what they believe, what they say today, they can say the opposite tomorrow. The propagandists who are spouting all of this American anti-Western propaganda, they lived on Western grants in the 1990s and advertised how progressive they were, including, by the way, Dmitry Medvedev, people who knew him in those days were amazed because he was, such an outspoken pro-Western minor political figure in St. Petersburg, lackey of Putin. But Russia is a nation of prostitutes because the people have no fixed beliefs. Whatever they are part of a machine, and they will conform to the requirements of the machine. And that's something, and this is true of Putin himself. And the ultimate object is simply power, and not any kind of greater Russia or Russian idea or defending the rights of Russian speakers or defending against NATO 23 years after the expansion of NATO 23 years after the fact. I mean, Putin himself said in a joint press conference with Leonid Kravchuk in 2002 that Ukraine had a perfect right to join NATO uh, because it's an independent, it makes its country, it makes its own security decisions. And he said that because that was what was, in the interest of his power at that time. In 2007, he said Russia had no designs whatsoever on Crimea. And they fully accepted Ukrainian sovereignty. So again, over and over. I mean, this is what happens to people when any kind of ethical and moral framework is totally destroyed in the interest of power and politics. And we fight it out in the West over a lot of questions, and it often gets nasty, but we do so within the framework of a society based on law, which means that ultimately it derives from a conception of morality. You don't have that, and that consciousness is so taken for granted in the West, with its implicit value attached to human life, that we're basically not aware of it, and we attributed it to the creatures in Russia who have been totally denuded of all of these moral considerations and have been reduced to total cynicism. And that's how they operate. Even when we say, does Putin want greater Russia? We're giving him too much credit. That he wants whatever is in the interest of his own power and those who are around him. And they all think, and those around him think the same way. And they justify it speciously with the phony rationalization that that the highest calling for Russia is to strengthen the state.
So if that's the case, what is it that Putin actually wishes to achieve in Ukraine? What is Putin's deeper ideology that if he has this, he'll check off the box and say, I succeeded as I wish to in Ukraine? Or is it like some people said, that he really can't afford for this war to end because his entire economy and state could unravel? What do you think?
Well, I think both are true. I think that what he wants, he has to. Unfortunately, there's no easy way out of this. Partially because of a situation which he has created for himself, which is in order to strengthen his power, he has to a certain extent, come off as a victor and achieve his objectives, or at least appear to achieve them. And though his objective is, as he said at the beginning, denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Russian propaganda still describes that as their objective. What does that mean in reality? It means the subjugation of Ukraine. Ukraine won't be subjugated even if the territories are occupied, if it has a powerful army backed up by the West and a flourishing economy. And Putin knows that. That's why he's not in a hurry to negotiate.
So
He'll
what?
be in a hurry. He'll be in a hurry to negotiate when his hold on power begins to be threatened. I mean, that it's as simple as that.
So what would challenge the Putin regime? What would put Putin in a position where he feels forced to negotiate?
Well, it for one thing, a collapse of the Russian economy, which we're in a position to facilitate. Uh, the that is the needless to say, the strengthening of Ukraine militarily. But I'm inclined to believe that the economic measures might actually be more effective, uh, because I'm not inclined to idealize the Russians, especially those who have not fled the country and are still there and are giving their support uh, to what's going on. But I do know that Russian public opinion is very volatile, and under the right circumstances, it could change dramatically, especially if people find that the economy is really collapsing. And it could, but it will take an active will in the West. And we have to understand that we have to suffer some deprivations too. And we can't just we can't just concentrate on the price of eggs or whatever else we're concentrating on. Uh, and in order to get this message across, we have to counteract Russian propaganda and tell our own people, I'm saying Americans, but also the Brits, people in the West, who this really is. If, for example, I mean, just recently, the Global Civil Aviation Agency held Russia responsible, without going into detail, for the shooting down of MH17 in 2014. I mean, that fact is not stressed any more than a lot of the other atrocities are stressed. For example, the apartment bombings. What does it mean for a nation to give an order to deliberately? Now, the report of this Civil Aviation Authority was not very detailed. I couldn't find in there what exactly they were accusing Russia. They were simply saying Russia's responsible. Russia's definitely responsible. Russia could be responsible for moving uh, uh, Buk anti-aircraft batteries into an international lane used by civil aviation. That would be responsibility enough. But in reality, the responsibility is much graver. It was that they deliberately targeted a civilian airliner. So what do we say about a nation that which is for temporary military advantage would shoot down a civilian airliner belonging to another country? If we can get this message to Americans, it can make a difference. I don't have much faith in Donald Trump, let alone Steve Witkoff, who I think is a perfect symbol for the level of thought that is going into the foreign policy regarding Ukraine. But I do think that they will react to public opinion, and I think that's what those of us who understand the importance of a Ukrainian victory have to bear in mind. And that's the fact that the key to eventually putting an end to this war, a just end, is American public opinion. American public opinion can move the government the government can move the situation and take the steps that will be necessary for Ukraine to prevail. Ukraine can prevail if it's not caught in an endless war of attrition that it doesn't have the population for.
Absolutely the case. David, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason.